World History DBQ is an important part of the AP exam, with a 25% weight on your total score and a maximum time of 60 minutes. Let's learn how to write an essay that will earn you a 7. In this video, we'll assume that you're familiar with the basic layout of the DBQ. If needed, please use the link in the description to see the College Board's rubric for the DBQ. All right, let's get started. Today, we'll use the 2025 Set 1 DBQ prompt to go over a step-by-step process to writing a DBQ. As a reminder, you're given 7 documents to refer to, and the DBQ is graded on a 7-point scale. The AP exam gives 60 minutes in total for analyzing and writing the DBQ, with a suggestion of a 15-minute reading period, but you can take as much time as needed. As we read, we'll make note of HAP, the historical context, audience, purpose, and point of view, and how those factors affect the document. We'll also take into account whether the doc supports or refutes the argument outlined in the prompt. The prompt for our DBQ is: evaluate the extent to which new transportation and/or communication technologies affected African societies during the period circa 1850 to 1960. Let's get started on the first doc, which was written by Sierra Leone leaders to British colonial officials who recently conquered the area. We received a letter from the colonial governor sent to tell us that the British Queen now takes the whole of Temne country. We read the governor's letter and we now know the law that the governor puts on us, namely, that we are to pay a tax on our houses each year, so the government can build roads and a rail line. But we must inform you that we are not able to pay a tax for our own houses because we have no power and no money to do so. So please tell the governor we beg him not to impose the tax and to consider the old agreement he made with our fathers. Now, in this doc, it's clear that transportation technologies, like the roads and railroads the British would like to build, affected the people living in Sierra Leone to a relatively large extent, as they were unable to afford the tax. Based on the content of the doc and the role of the local leaders of Sierra Leone, the letters meant to convince the British not to impose the tax, which is an important factor to understanding the doc. Let's move on to the second doc. This doc is a photo from a book on South African history, published by a Protestant minister born in South Africa who emigrated to the U.S. The description says, the photograph shows 2 African employees of the Kimberley diamond mines in South Africa. The caption reads, going home from the mines. These 2 Bechuanas, members of the Swana people of Southern Africa, have been working at Kimberley or Johannesburg, have received their pay in the golden coin of the British realm, and are traveling on their road from 100 to 400 miles to their distant home. They carry a few trophies purchased in the great city, and reckon themselves as they approach their own town among the heroes and wise men of their tribe. This doc again supports the prompt, as the African miners have secured jobs in the British colonial empire at mines far from their homes with the aid of well-connected roads. The doc implies that this is a positive aspect of colonialism, as it says that they reckon themselves among the heroes and wise men of their tribe. South African diamond and gold mining during the colonial period is an important historical context of this photo, and provides the background for the lives of tens of thousands of miners. Also keep in mind that the author of the book was born in South Africa and published a book solely on South Africa. Thus, this portrayal may be more positive of South Africa and its people. Now let's move to the third doc, which is a record of telegrams between a British colonial official in the Gold Coast and one in London. The doc says, April 30th, 1900, Loda Chamberlain. Update on the fighting against the Ashanti. Ashanti warriors launched a serious attack on a telegraph clerk while he was repairing telegraph lines that had previously been severed by the Ashanti. Other telegraph clerks report Ashanti troops have effectively blockaded the main road to the city of Kumasi since April 25th. Government troops from Lagos in Nigeria were sent to Kumasi. We hope that they will succeed in reopening communication. And May 1st, 1900, Chamberlain to Lowe. In response to your telegram of April 30th, we will be sending 250 more troops from southern Nigeria to Kumasi to counter Ashanti attacks. I will also send 50 additional frontier police from Sierra Leone to the Ashanti territories for protection of British life and property. This doc is a communication between British colonial authorities about Ashanti attacks against the British. This dialogue is likely to portray the Ashanti negatively, as it is from the British perspective, and is damaging to British infrastructure. Moving on, we'll look at Doc 4, which is an advertisement for a British shipping company that also offered rides for passengers. As we leave the ship at Alexandria and board the train to Cairo, we may observe simple farm and rural scenes, but also here and there, the huge new cotton mills that remind us that Egypt is progressive and up to date. Cairo has changed greatly since 1882, and it is inevitable that, in a country so closely in touch with Western civilization, many traditional local shops have been replaced by storefronts with large windows displaying products of European industry. In the west end of Cairo, huge hotels and commercial buildings have replaced the former delightful residences of the elite. In the hotels, the vibrant social life of modern Cairo is in full swing, making the city attractive to many. This doc clearly shows the change that new transportation and communication technologies had on African societies and their structure. The advertisement describes the changes that have occurred that have transformed the countryside into an industrial, touristic, and modern city, all influenced by the West. The point of view of this doc is also essential to understand, as Britain had control over Egypt without colonizing it, which may lead to bias towards portraying Egypt positively. The next doc is a British report to the Parliament on the spread of tuberculosis in South Africa. In those towns which were the first to be opened up by the railway, the disease of tuberculosis has prevailed the longest and to the greatest extent. The opening up of South Africa as a result of the development of diamond and gold mining has led to the creation of labor centers and the clustering of the African and mixed race populations in towns and in separate workers' quarters, where the conditions of housing and general health have been bad in the extreme. For the first time, increasing numbers of Africans are crowding into urban centers in search of work that dire economic conditions and expanding needs are forcing them to undertake. With these changes have come changes in habits, in clothing, and in diet, the adoption of European vices, and exposure to unhealthy conditions of labor in mines and elsewhere. It is evident that the rise of industry has produced exactly those conditions that can best account for the spread of tuberculosis in South Africa. This doc, as an internal British report, is likely credible, as South Africa was a colony of Britain at the time, and the spread of tuberculosis was an important topic to analyze in order to prevent its further spread. As the doc points out, the new transportation technology of railroads not only spread tuberculosis, but also led to establishment of hubs of diamond and gold mine workers. Thus, this doc clearly supports the argument in the prompt. Let's move to Doc 6, which is an excerpt from a book on the history of the Gold Coast, written by British colonial officials employed there. The completion of the railway from the port of Sekondi to Kumasi in 1903 has been followed by the construction of another line from the port of Accra to the cocoa-bearing districts, and these two lines have enormously facilitated trade. The first line has also been responsible for the establishment of numerous European trading firms in Kumasi, which has become a great trading center. The abolition of the slave trade and the acquisition of most of the gold-bearing lands in the colony by European entrepreneurs has caused the local people to seek work in timber, rubber collecting, and agriculture, which the government has encouraged by holding agricultural shows and providing traveling instructors to assist farmers with expert advice. A submarine cable to England was connected in July 1886, and telegraphic communication between different parts of the country has been extended even to the northern districts. This doc is likely quite realistic, though still biased, as British officials who were stationed on the Gold Coast wrote the doc. It highlights the effects that railroads had on trade, namely that European trading firms have been established, and an increasing number of locals have begun to work in timber, rubber, and agriculture. The doc also touches on the telegraph line that extends from the Gold Coast to Britain that has allowed for communication across great distances, which supports the claim that new transportation and communication technologies had significant impacts on African societies. Let's move to the seventh and last doc. This doc is an excerpt of a memoir written by a Nigerian historian about his childhood in the 1950s and 1960s. The trains on which I sometimes took joyrides after skipping school were part of the changes that the British had introduced to Nigeria before I was born. By the 1930s, the new railway system had connected Ibadan, my home city, to the rest of the country. Ibadan was in the heartland of the cocoa growing belt. Millions of cocoa bags were brought to the city, to be carried by train to the port in Lagos for onward transmission to Europe. Ibadan was also in the region producing palm oil and peanuts, which ended up in far-flung places such as New York and London. The trains brought new settlers to Ibadan. They created new neighborhoods defined by ethnicity, race, and education. The old city, whose native residents called each other Mesiogo, had remained intact, But the new immigrants had established their own new city, which had become fully developed, well-populated, and vibrant. The Mesiogo would travel from the old to the new city to shop, buying goods from the Lebanese, Syrians, and Indians, as well as from the Igbo, Edo, Urhobo, and Ibibio immigrants from other parts of Nigeria who had flocked to the city. The new areas were the first to acquire the modern amenities of electricity and pipe-borne water. This doc's point of view is especially important, as it was written by a Nigerian with a first-hand account of the country and its changes. The doc also supports the claim that new transportation technologies affected African societies through its integration into the entertainment of children, connection of trade, and establishment of immigrant hubs. Now that we're done reading the 7 docs and making note of the content in HAP, we'll begin writing the essay. First, we'll start with contextualization. For this point, you'll need to describe historical events and processes either before, during, or continued from the time period in the prompt, and that relate to the prompt. The College Board's AP World History course and exam description, the CED, also says that this needs to be substantial and more than a phrase or reference. We'll now think of other events that relate to the effect of new transportation and communication technologies on African societies between 1850 and 1960. We can think about other events that relate to transportation and communication in other parts of the world, other impacts of Europeans on Africa, the effect of such technologies in other parts of the world, etc. Here's a list of events that could work. Slave trade led to reliance on European goods, changing power dynamics within Africa, and changed gender roles. Indian Ocean East Coast trade and trans-Saharan trade thrived, and European states colonized most of Africa, beginning in the second half of the 19th century, in order to gain hold of raw materials. Using these ideas, we can write the contextualization, which should ideally include some information about the past, and link it to the time period in the prompt. Prior to 1850, the slave trade affected states in West Africa by increasing reliance on Europe for manufactured goods, as well as altering power dynamics between different African states. The slave trade also increased polygamy, as more men were used as slaves in the Americas than women, with women taking on the former roles of their husbands. Additionally, trans-Saharan trade and East Coast trade in the Indian Ocean also thrived. Around 1850, European states became interested in gaining hold of raw materials in Africa, among other regions. Otto von Bismarck hosted the Berlin Conference in order to peacefully divide up Africa among European powers. Thus began the on-ground establishment of power in Africa. Now we'll move on to the thesis, which is worth 1 point. The thesis needs to take a stance on the prompt and be fully contained in either the introduction, conclusion, or both. For this DBQ prompt, the documents mostly support the argument in the prompt, so our thesis statement will support the argument in the prompt. Here are some of the effects of new communication and transportation technologies on African societies. Connection through railroad and train. Facilitation of workers to travel longer distances to work. Quick communication between European colonial officials and their governments. Spread of disease, and growth of trading cities. However, there is also evidence against the argument in the prompt, namely that technologies did not spread to all areas. Many local elites still ruled, and past traditions and customs continued to survive. Incorporating all of this evidence into a complex thesis that argues both sides. Here's an example thesis. To a large extent, new transportation and communication technologies affected African societies significantly during the period circa 1850 to 1960, through such impacts as the greater connection of the continent through railroads and trains, the facilitating of workers who traveled long distances to work, the quick communication between colonial officials and their governments in Europe, the spread of disease and the growth of trading cities. But to a lesser extent, the impact of such technologies were minimal due to the limited extent of use of such technologies, the continued ruling of societies by prior elites, and continued practice of local traditions and customs. Keep in mind that this paragraph structure can also be changed by, for example, separating the argument and counter-argument in separate sentences, or by placing the counter-argument before the argument. After contextualization and the thesis statement, we can move on to supporting the thesis statement with evidence. There are 2 ways you can earn points for evidence. You can describe the content of 3 docs for 1 point, or you can describe the content of 4 docs and use it to support the thesis statement for 2 points. Remember, 7 documents are given, but only 4 are needed to cite evidence from. So remember to choose docs that feel easy to explain and connect to the thesis for you. In this video, we'll learn how to earn 2 points for the evidence. While referring to the docs to provide evidence to support the thesis statement, we'll also remember about the effect of HAP on the document. For the analysis and reasoning points, you can either earn 1 or 2 points. For 1 point, you can relate the HAP to the thesis statement for 2 docs. There are many different ways that you can earn the second point, including by explaining multiple themes or perspectives, explaining multiple causes and effects, similarities and differences, and continuities and changes, explaining connections within and across time periods or geographical areas, using 7 documents to support an argument, and relating the HAP of documents to the argument for 4 docs. For this video, we'll be earning the complexity point by identifying and applying the HAP of 4 docs, and doing 1 extra doc to try to ensure that we apply HAP correctly for 4 docs. So, to summarize, for each of 5 docs, we'll analyze the effects of its HAP, describe its contents, and use it to support an argument in response to the prompt. Throughout the DBQ, we'll also try to incorporate evidence beyond the doc, which is worth 1 point and involves referring to a substantial amount of specific historical evidence to support the thesis and is different from the information included in the contextualization. One tip is to list some things you remember from memory about the topic and the prompt and any related facts when you first begin writing the DBQ. Then, you can use some for the contextualization portion and be sure to save some to spread throughout the doc or in a more concentrated area to use. Remember that as long as you have enough time, you can never overwrite, and adding in extra names or approximate dates may always have a chance of helping. For this example essay, we chose to place the majority of the beyond the doc evidence in the last paragraph, but we also included some spread throughout the evidence paragraphs, and a short bit in the thesis statement. Let's take a look at which docs to use for sourcing using HAP and supporting our thesis. After reviewing the docs, the first doc is not a strong contender to use, as the events described within it, namely African locals needing to finance the construction of transportation technologies, were not widespread. The second doc, however, is a strong document to use, as mining was an important part of European colonialism and history in Africa. We'll now refer back to our bullet points from before to describe the contents of the second document, connect it to the argument, and source it using its HAP. Document 2, a labeled photo from a book published by a Protestant minister born in South Africa and emigrated to the United States in 1899, depicts African diamond miners who are traveling home on a journey of a few hundred miles. The image is made possible by the context of European expansion of extraction of raw materials in Africa, as Europeans exploited the labor of low-paid African workers who worked in harsh conditions. Additionally, due to the author's point of view and experience as someone who lived in South Africa, his portrayal in the image is likely accurate. The document demonstrates the effect of newly constructed roads on the work life of Africans, as work no longer remained local and Africans often traveled in order to work. Thus, the roads that Europeans constructed in order to facilitate industrial ventures often altered the lives of African workers as job opportunities changed. For the next doc, we'll choose Doc 3, as it directly represents locals' views towards new communication technologies, namely telegraph lines and roads. Document 3, a 1900 record of telegrams between a British official in the Gold Coast and one in London, informs of the attacks of Ashanti warriors on British telegraph lines and roads. Due to the message's informative purpose, their contents are likely relatively accurate and reflect the true situation. Also, because the authors are British, they express an antagonistic attitude toward the Ashanti Africans. The document proves the effect of the telegraph and roads on African societies, as such technologies allowed the British to communicate efficiently and effectively, the opposite of the desires of the Ashanti, as they resisted British colonial expansion, leading the Ashanti to damage British means of connection and creating challenges to British invasion. Thus, such technologies not only facilitated European expansion, but also became a target for Africans to resist European expansion by damaging their technologies. Choosing the next doc, the fourth doc, also supports the argument in the prompt on the widespread adoption of new transportation and communication technologies and its effects and changes it brought. Here's what we'll say for this doc. Document 4, a 1908 advertisement from a British shipping company that also provided passenger services, describes the pristine scenes of local life in Cairo, Egypt, in addition to more modern scenes of industry, tourism, and urban culture. Due to the document's point of view as British and purpose as an advertisement, it likely contains bias in its description of Cairo, likely portraying it as more appealing and Western than it is. Thus, Cairo is likely not as Western and industrial as portrayed, though the advertisement likely contains some truth. The document further proves the effect of such transportation as large ships and trains on African societies as they brought tourism and allowed for greater connection to Europe, seen in the influence of European industry, commerce, and urban culture. For the next doc, we'll choose the fifth doc. It has potential to analyze given its content, introducing a unique impact of the spread of rail travel, namely the spread of disease. Furthermore, document 5, a 1914 British report given to Parliament on the situation of tuberculosis in South Africa, indicates that the spread of mining through railroads led to crowded, unsanitary, living spaces of laborers that facilitated the spread of tuberculosis and European culture, including dress and food. Due to the report's purpose to inform the Parliament on the spread of tuberculosis in South Africa, and the point of view of the authors as British officials on the British Parliamentary Commission, the report likely depicts the accurate historical background and current situation of tuberculosis in South Africa, as the authors would have been motivated to provide an accurate, detailed account in order to facilitate British intervention, if necessary, to curb the spread of the disease. The document demonstrates the effect of rail travel on African societies as it spread tuberculosis in European workers, who introduced their culture to African mining workers. Lastly, for the final doc, we'll look at Doc 6, which touches on the impact of railroads on trade. Document 6, an excerpt from a 1915 book published by British colonial officials in the Gold Coast, describes the growth of trading cities and the facilitating of the travel of Africans for work through the expansion of railway lines. Due to the author's points of view as British colonial officials, they may have been motivated to exaggerate the positive benefits of railway expansion on African economic growth in order to justify British expansion in Africa. The document proves the effect new transportation technologies had on African societies through its description of the growth of new trading cities, influencing local life, and the facilitating of African jobs in work for Europeans, collecting raw materials and in agriculture, thus providing jobs for Africans but limiting them to low wages, long hours, and poor working conditions. Lastly, we'll add in a paragraph with a counter-argument to the thesis, using knowledge we have about other historical events not mentioned in the given docs. In addition to the 3 historical processes described in our thesis statement that argue against the main stance of the thesis, here are some more ideas that will add to our counter-argument. Some African societies resisted and limited the use of new transportation and communication technologies by colonizers. Many new technologies spread slowly and to a small extent at first, and colonization had a much greater effect on African societies than did new transportation and communication technologies. Here's the finished paragraph. However, to a lesser extent, the impact of such technologies were minimal due to the limited extent of use of such technologies, the continued status of prior elites, and continued practice of local traditions and customs. For example, Document 3 describes the resistance of local Ashanti people by damaging British telegraph lines and roads. Thus, they were able to limit the effect of new technologies on their societies. Additionally, such technologies were not spread evenly across Africa, as more desirable regions of Africa were more developed in infrastructure, but less desirable regions were less developed. Furthermore, the introduction of new technologies, though often brought in conjunction with new colonial hold of Africa, influenced the status of prior elites little, as despite the European domination of the African economy, local elites continued to play a role in societies across Africa and continued to participate in local customs of dress, diet, religion, etc. Lastly, colonial takeover itself likely led to more change in African societies from 1850-1960 than new communication and transportation technologies, as Europeans exploited African labor in order to extract palm oil for the oiling of industrial machinery. Rubber in the Belgian Congo Free State, which prior to being held by the Congo, was a private colony held by King Leopold II, and locals who didn't meet rubber quotas were amputated. Gold in the Gold Coast, ivory in the Ivory Coast, and diamonds, in addition to being utilized as labor for the development and expansion of railroads, roads, telegraph lines, and other infrastructure. Now notice the detail included in the last paragraph, describing particularly where certain raw materials were extracted, what they were used for, and how they were maintained, is not necessary for describing colonial takeover. However, the author included the details as part of evidence beyond the doc, which when combined with other information and reasoning written from memory, Earn the beyond the dock point throughout the essay by demonstrating sophistication. Writing a DBQ is a skill that requires accurate and thoughtful planning, something that requires repeated practice. For more help, use the resources linked in the description and comment with any questions.